Hi, I'm Hel Spandler. I'm a professor of mental health at the University of Central Lancashire. For several years, I've been researching aversion therapy, which is a type of conversion therapy that was afflicted on lesbian, gay and bisexual and trans people in the 1960s and early 70s. It's probably one of the most cruel and, certainly one of the most cruel and controversial treatments in psychology. And today I'm with Pauline Collier, who's been telling her story about aversion therapy more recently. And Pauline is also a retired educational psychologist. And since her retirement, she's been talking about her experience of aversion therapy. So today we're going to talk about that in more detail. So Pauline, you were born in 1945.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up and becoming aware of your sexuality in the 50s, I guess, would it have been?
That's right, yeah. I think because psychology and psychiatry have always looked for pathology in childhood to explain lesbian sexuality. I think I looked long and hard at my childhood to see if I could spot anything that had made me lesbian. And when I looked, my mother was an exceptional woman. She was very kind. She was very nurturing. She worked full time. She always worked full time. She worked in factories. She worked in hairdressing, and she worked in the co-op of all places. So she was quite special in the sense. She always affirmed what I did. And being born in 1945, which was the last year of World War II, my father was in the army, and he was a driving instructor in the Royal Engineers. And when the war ended, he stayed in the army for a couple of years. And at that time, we lived in a sort of small, old, rented terrace house near the railway. But when he was discharged, we got this brand new council house. And then my brother was born. So our new house was directly opposite some tennis courts, and he was a good athlete, my father. So he practiced playing tennis with me by the hour, which was a very positive thing. And in fact, I became quite a good tennis player. I got county trials at the age of 14, but tennis is for rich people, and I couldn't carry on after that. But when I went to high school, and I went to an all-girls grammar school, I was captain of netball, I was captain of hockey, I was captain of tennis, and in the upper sixth, I was the school games captain. And then when I went to university, I was in the third year, I became vice president of the athletic union. And when I think about my childhood, I think about Michael Rutter's work, because he talked about protective factors in childhood that prevented you from developing mental health problems later on. I think that was probably around self-esteem and so on. So in terms of what he identified as protective factors for mental health, I had good parenting, I had a degree of academic success and a lot of sporting achievement. But whilst all that was going on and I was performing and presenting as quite a successful person, at the same time there was this awful deep secret inside myself that I was having feelings for other girls and women that I knew I shouldn't talk about, I knew I shouldn't mention. I had to work hard to keep them a secret. And I remember when it first started, I think I was in junior one in the primary school, and we had this student teacher placed with us. And when she arrived, I thought, wow, she is lovely. I do like her. And I think I fell madly in love. And but after 6 weeks, she left, and I thought it was the end of the world. I thought I was going to die of loss. Anyway, I didn't. And the next year, the same thing happened, and we had another student teacher. I got a crush on her as well, and I remember when she left, the day she left, I remember following her to the bus because I knew where she got on the bus to go home. It was rather sad, really. And then when I went to high school, I had a crush on the dinner table prefect. And then in my form, I started. It was like an emotional intensity with a girl in my form. She used to sit 2 rows behind me. We had those desks, and she was 2 rows behind me. And I couldn't concentrate on any of the work because I was constantly wanting to look round and just make that eye contact that always lingers, a little too long. And I remember we got the school bus, and we used to sit next to each other, and we used to press our arms hard against each other. That was the ultimate in the sort of physical contact. And it was so powerful. I thought I was going to swoon. It was like that. But then she left, and I went into the sixth form. And all this time, it was getting more and more difficult to keep. To keep the secret, and the energy that it would take up, having to pretend, because I had boyfriend as well during that time, because that's what you did. And some nice boys, I must say, but at the end I had no emotional attraction towards them, no sexual feelings for them at all. But they served a purpose in keeping the secret. And I mean, what you heard on television and all that sort of thing. I mean, I used to go to the library and look for hours for stories about women who might be attracted to other women, and there was nothing. And when you look at films, the only film was Doris Day and Calamity Jane singing "Once I Had a Secret Love."
Yeah.
Other people are probably too young to remember that, but that was lovely. And books as well. There was nothing in books, so you felt like the only one. You felt completely isolated, and my energy was sucked away, and I was feeling more and more isolated. And then in the upper sixth, the week I left school, the lower sixth girls gave a party. And at this party, and I must say I don't have any clear-eyed remembrance of this party, I ended up in bed with one of the lone six girls. And after all those years, from junior one in primary school of repressing and keeping all this secret, it was like, well, it was falling in love. By the morning, sort of I had a relationship which by then, because I was 18 then, wasn't a child, I was 18, and that was very exciting. But 2 weeks afterwards, Suzanne, I'll call her Suzanne, had a boyfriend, and she was so overwhelmed at keeping this secret as well that she told her boyfriend, and he went straight to her father, who was not a very nice man actually, and he was absolutely furious. He was livid, and said, on no account must you see that girl again. This has to stop immediately. And at around the same time, my mother found a letter. I don't know whether it was one she'd written or one I'd written, and she was lovely and kind. She said, she was quite upset and said, do you want to see someone about it? So that year, I didn't get into university that first year because I applied for history, and that was a fairly miserable sort of year because sometimes we could see each other. No mobile phones in those days. You had to go to the local phone box and so on, and letters. And she was still in her last year at school. And we decided that we'd both apply to Durham because by this time I'd met someone who was doing psychology at university. It was quite a young subject then. and it sounded very exciting and interesting, and it really captured my imagination. So I applied for psychology and got in at Durham, but she didn't get in. She got in at Manchester. And all this time, well, not all this time, but after I went to Durham, the boy who'd been my boyfriend, who'd been very supportive, they were spending time together, and she was really struggling, and I think they might have gone together, I'm not sure about that, but they went to see her GP, and the GP knew about the treatment at Crumpsall Hospital. And
because you were in Manchester, weren't you?
I was, yeah. Well, I was in Durham.
Yeah.
She was in Manchester. She went to see the GP
in Manchester.
Yeah. So when I came back at Christmas after my first term at Durham, she told me that she'd been having this aversion therapy, and I just felt very, I suppose, let down and very depressed about the whole thing.
So nothing had happened when you were in Durham?
No.
In terms of
other than, a bit of some communication.
Yeah.
So she'd had this aversion therapy and thought that I should go. And by that time, I was just so miserable, I don't think I cared what I did, really. So she fixed up an appointment for me with Feldman and McCulloch at Crumpsall Hospital.
So just to interject, so you were starting to learn about, you were beginning your degree.
Oh, yeah.
Your first degree in psychology.
Yeah.
And at that time, psychology was heavily behaviourist. I mean, that was the thing, wasn't it? This was the thing that was going to transform. It was going to make psychology a science, and so you were learning about this stuff, and then coming home for the summer, and a treatment which is based in that idea was offered to you.
Yeah.
Because people might be thinking, like, why would you volunteer for something like that?
Yeah.
But this sort of helps, I think, understand the context of that in some way, that fitted with what you were learning as what was seen as accepted practice then in psychology, and being a young student eager to...
Yeah. Well, it was sort of the flavour of the month, because psychology was trying to make itself a respectable empirical science. And I felt let down, really, because I'd chosen psychology because I thought it was about emotions and feelings. So
you felt let down by psychology?
By psychology.
Or by, when you said that, I thought you meant that you felt let down by Suzanne going to...
Oh, I did, yes. I mean, that was the personal blow.
Yeah, right.
But professionally, because I think I've said that by the end of the first year, I'd learnt a lot about rats in mazes, dogs in boxes, monkeys in cages, but I'd learnt very little about emotions and intuition, because at the time, because of behaviourism, psychology wanted to train you to be an objective observer of behaviour. You weren't emotionally or psychologically part of what was going on.
And do you think your desire to do psychology was related in some way to wanting to find out a little bit more about and understand yourself a bit in some way, or understand what was the kind of impetus, do you think, for studying psychology rather than history or something else?
It was mainly that. It sounded this young man I met who was doing it made it, talked about that sort of thing. Now, I suspect he might have been at another university, because not all universities, some universities were still rooted in psychoanalytical theory and so on.
So this, because I remember you've said before that because there was at this point, so this is the 60s, early 60s, so there was a bit of a conflict in a way, or a tussle between the behaviourists and the psychoanalysts about what's the best theory of the human and mind and behaviour and everything. So I remember you saying somewhere that you if it was a psychoanalytic framing, you'd be seen as a pervert, as a sexual perversion. And if it was a behaviour, then it would be like a behavioural disorder. If you assumed that being gay or lesbian was a pathology, and in some ways it was better to worst of two evils, it was kind of better to feel like you had a behavioural problem than a pervert.
It sounded much more acceptable
that was
to have a
more
behaviour disorder than be a sexual pervert.
Yeah, that had too many negative connotations to it.
Yeah.
So at that time, the shift from sexual perversion and also sort of moral defect in a way to something that was a behavioural thing that could be rectified by some kind of weird kind of intervention, which is what behaviourism was kind of based on, a kind of blunt, a sort of a crude, blunt kind of way of treating sexual desire or sexuality, really.
Yes. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about how that how you ended up going to get this intervention and what it was like for you. And some of the background to that.
What happened was that Suzanne told me about this, you know, and I can't remember what details she gave me, you know, because my mind was just filled that she felt so, that she'd had this done to her and taken away from me. So when, so she said she'd get me an appointment with Feldman and McCulloch. So by this I thought, you know, well, why not?
And McCulloch was the psychiatrist and Feldman was the psychologist that were developing this type of aversion therapy at Manchester Crumpsall Hospital.
I went to, she arranged for this appointment in the Easter holidays. So I went along to Crumpsall Hospital and Philip Feldman was the clinical psychologist and Malcolm McCulloch was the psychiatrist. They were very charming, very welcoming, and they introduced me to the director of psychiatry, who was Northridge J. DeVille Mather. I never met anyone with a name like that before, even at Durham. And he spoke very highly of the treatment they were doing. It was having a lot of success and so on. And of course, there I was, 18, working class girl, brought up to please and to seek approval, particularly male approval. And there were these three important doctors, you know, saying, "Oh, we can help you with this awful disease you've got." And at the time, I thought, well, why not? Because by that time, the inner conflict was quite toxic. It was quite harmful.
I think the other thing to sort of stress, which is why I asked that first question away about what it was like, Graham, because this is 1965 we're talking about now. Yeah. So I think that's right. By the time you got it. Yeah. And this is before the gay liberation movement. Before, you know, there wasn't a movement. There wasn't a progressive kind of.
There was
sense
no movement.
There was nothing
to
look to, and if there was anything, it was very, very hidden and very sort of underground, if you like. Yeah. So there was nothing as a support, as a potential other option. That felt like the only option to you at that time.
Felt like because they didn't say, you know, it's okay to be a lesbian. It's fine, you know, just. Get on with it and don't be ashamed.
So there wasn't affirmative kind of sort of nothing. You know, acceptance of that was the option. That was the only option you felt that was possible at that time for you.
But I mean, clearly, the aim was to destroy my developing lesbian identity and make me into a nice heterosexual woman. I don't remember feeling any particular desire to be heterosexual. I just wanted the inner emotional
So it wasn't that you were going and saying, make me a heterosexual. No. It was make this pain go away, really.
Make this emotional pain go away.
So it wasn't about, you didn't want to be straight. Yeah. So it wasn't that they were kind of go, oh yes, we'll make you, you know.
Yes. You know, I want to wear nice clothes and false eyelashes and stuff. I just, no.
So tell us about the actual...
Oh, well, what they did, I said they were charming and welcoming. They said, if you come in the summer, we can offer you a job in reception, and it'll be like a work experience for your psychology. God, I was naive. But, you know, I thought, well, that, you know, what a good idea. So that's what happened. I went along and they I did a couple of days, filing and answering the phone and so on, and then they took me up to the treatment room. They hadn't really said what they were going to do.
Right, so it wasn't explained to you?
Not really, no. It was quite theoretical of, we're using the best from behaviour therapy and so on and so on. Didn't say.
So did they mention they were going to use electric shocks?
I think I knew from Suzanne anyway.
Right, but they didn't actually tell you?
I don't think, I can't remember, to be honest. It was, so they took me up to this room, and it was in semi-darkness, and I remember there was like an office chair in the middle with arms, and there was a screen in front of the chair, and then behind the chair there was all this sort of monitors and machinery and so on. And this male, I think John Pinchoff he was called, he was obviously in charge of the treatment programme. He was a trainee. He must only have been a couple of years older than me, in fact. So he told me to sit down. So I sat down, and he put these electrodes on my arms, and he said, we'll have to sort out what sort of electric shocks. So he started giving me electric shocks of different strengths
sort of thing,
to see what I could, if any of them made me scream, sort of thing. Anyway, he eventually decided on one, and it made me. It made me flinch. They made me flinch, and they made me sweat. But of course, I was brought up to be obedient, so I didn't say, stop it or anything like that. I just let it happen. So he chose a strength for the electric shock, and then on the screen he showed me pictures of women, and they were half naked women, like straight out of what was page 3 of the Sun in those days. And he seemed quite proud of these. He said, which one do you find most attractive? I said, well, none of them. Don't find any of them attractive at all. I said, the women I've fallen in love with have been attracted to have all had their clothes on. So we did this exercise, and in the end, he looked a bit bemused because I tried to explain that lesbianism wasn't just a sort of semi-pornographic sexual thing. It was about emotional and psychological intensity and so on. He looked a bit bemused, really. So he said, well, choose one that you find most attractive. So in the end, I think I said, oh, well, that one. And then, having done that ranking, he put some slides of men up.
Similarly naked or half naked, sort of, were they? Just so people get a sense.
I can't remember. I think they were sort of rugged and.
Yeah, because what I'm thinking is the sort of pictures that, because for sort of context, they'd been doing this to gay men. For a few years.
They did.
And I think they
gay men, didn't they? Yeah.
And I think they, from what we can work out, it sounds like we don't know how many women that they'd tried this on, and maybe only a small number. Yeah. So this was quite experimental. So I'm thinking that they probably used similar pictures that they were using for men, but reversed them as a kind of assumption that this was a similar kind of. Yeah. And I was thinking about these pictures sound more like the pictures
they were
in his fantasy,
in their fantasy. A male fantasy of
exactly. Yeah. Sorry, I've interrupted you.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm sure that was an issue. I think the women, because the book that they produced, this great big thick tome, Homosexual Therapy and Assessment, was it 44 men and 4 women?
4 women, yeah.
But we thought 2 in the end, just me and Suzanne, didn't we?
It was hard to, because I've read it, painfully read the whole book, trying to work out if they were talking about the same women or two different women. It's difficult to tell. It wasn't very clear.
Yeah.
So there's either two women
Yeah.
repeated or they're four different women, and it's quite unclear. But there were definitely, you and Suzanne were two of those people. And I think it's worth also saying that you had no idea till we met many years later that you were actually in the book, that you were case studies in this book and in several papers that they'd written as success stories.
They wrote quite a lot of papers, didn't they?
Based on this as a successful treatment for homosexuality, as it was referred to then.
I know that that review that I quoted in my article in the British Journal of Psychiatry, and that I think John Johnson he was called. I think his article opened with, the success therapeutic story of our time, what a lot to be proud of. And then he made that comment about the wizardry of the electric circuitry and how ingenious they'd been. And that absolutely sent a chill through me when I read that. I thought, my God, because by that time I was seeing it much more clearly for what it was than when I rather naively went into it.
Yes, so I mean, do you want to carry on telling your story of how many? I mean, as much as you want to say about the actual intervention that you experienced and how you experienced it. I mean, as much detail as you feel comfortable.
I got the electric shocks, the strength they were going to use. I'd got my women on the screen and then the men. So what they did was that after they put the picture of my favourite woman on the screen, and then sometimes they gave me electric shock immediately. And as soon as I'd had the electric shock, the picture of the woman disappeared because I was relieved then not to have the electric shock, and they put the picture of one of the men up.
So it's classic kind of behavioural conditioning, isn't it? Is that you reward bad. That's. I mean, do you want to say a little bit about how did you understand it in those terms at that time?
I did.
You kind of I
wouldn't want to bore you with all the unconditioned reflexes and stimuli and all that sort of thing, and Pavlov's dogs and so on. But at its simple level, if behaviour is followed by reward, it's more likely to continue, and if behaviour is if behaviour is punished, in most cases it's less likely to occur. So it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and I mean it's very, very crude, and also seen as a sort of learning problem, which is also how
that's right.
Sexuality and gender expression were often seen as a something that you learn. So what you need to do is stop.
You need to unlearn
it. Exactly.
Yes, you learn the behaviour in the first place. It's socially constructed, and then you unlearn it by being given electric shocks.
Yeah. So once you'd already got to the point where you had faulty learning, as it was seen, then you had to do something to rectify the faulty learning in some way.
I had a disorder of behaviour. Yeah. So after immediately I got an electric shock. Sometimes there would be a break of 30 seconds. Now, 30 seconds is a long time when you're waiting for this electric shock that makes you flinch and sweat. But what was sort of clever in the sense about that is that it built up a level of anxiety and fear whilst you were waiting. So not only the pain of the physical shock, but the psychological anxiety and fear, really, of waiting for it, were sort of combining together. Yeah. So you got the electric shock after 30 seconds, looking at the picture of the woman, and then it changed because you thought, that's happened now, and the picture of the man came up.
So this is McCulloch and Feldman's kind of their own, because this technique, the aversion therapy, was used in lots of different hospitals in this country and in other countries as well, and they all did it slightly differently. So this, what you're describing as Feldman and McCulloch's specific, what they called anticipatory avoidance therapy.
Because there was the build-up, anticipating the shock. Yeah.
And then you had this illusion of being able to control it, so you could at some point stop the electric shock by choosing a picture of a man.
That's right, you could press a button and not have an electric shock by choosing a man.
Yeah. Which is, it's incredible when you think about it now, but at the time, because it's all part of the context in which this was happening which this was all accepted kind of ideas and theories about human sexuality and stuff. And you were being taught this in the university setting.
Yeah. So it authenticated it. What was happening to me.
Yeah.
Just at that point, when you talked about the different hospitals implementing it in different ways, it reminds me of Jeremy, who also was a gay man who had aversion therapy, and I've read his book and it's very powerful, and he talks about he was in the sixth form at school, just about to take his A-levels, and he'd fallen in love with this other lad at school, and he'd become very upset about it at one point, and he told his teacher, he was in a Catholic grammar school, he told his teacher, because he thought his teacher would, just comfort him and console him, but his teacher went to the head teacher, and the head teacher said, this is an awful disease you've got, and we know how we can cure it. And if you go to your GP, they'll refer you to the hospital. And the GP confirmed that it was indeed a terrible disease. Oh, the head teacher had said to him, if you don't do this, we'll tell your parents, we'll exclude you from school, and you won't be able to take your A-levels and get into university. So that was his choice. So he went to see the GP. The GP said it was a terrible disease and referred him to the hospital. And when he went to the hospital, they took him into the treatment room, and he was told to strip naked. And they stripped him naked, and he said, I could feel the psychiatrist's eyes on me, following me. And he said I could see the disgust in his eyes. And they sat him down in a chair, and they actually strapped his arms to the chair, which, mine were never strapped to the chair, but his was strapped to the chair. And he was given, I think, quite powerful electric shocks.
So we met. So fast forward a few years ago, we met. So you met Jeremy, and also a woman, Caroline, a trans woman who'd also experienced aversion therapy in a similar way. And I don't know if it's one of the first times people have kind of got together like that, because there is. This was a practice that was mostly afflicted on gay men, but also trans women as cross-dressers or transvestites, as it was called then. And some lesbians also experienced this intervention. And I wondered if you had any reflections about the difference in those experiences, because interesting, a lesbian, a gay man, and a trans woman all having similar treatment, and they were kind of different, weren't they?
They were different. The way as Rebecca says, who did the Birmingham report, it was like a cottage industry. And because there wasn't any sharing of information at that point, the different psychiatrists could do what they want. Strip you naked, strap your arms to the chair.
They had sort of free reign in a way, because the wider society was so homophobic and transphobic and heteronormative and all the rest of it. And it was seen that being gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, whatever, was unacceptable. So treat it was acceptable then, because it was unacceptable. So this is like, and yet there were sort of some differences in, I mean, it was the same kind of treatment, the same principle, which is that you've had some sort of faulty learning and you need to unlearn.
Well, the principles were the same, but I think the level of cruelty was different.
Yeah.
I mean, Jeremy being stripped naked, Carolyn wasn't stripped naked, but her arms were strapped to the chair, and the electric shocks made her shiver and quake in a sense. And she said for nearly 40 years afterwards, whenever that memory went through her mind, she said whether or not she was driving the car or teaching or whatever, she started to shiver. That has stopped now, but that was a long time to carry that harm.
And this all happened around the same time, which is around the mid-late 60s, was all around this time. So it was a concentrated period where basically people were being experimented on, really, to sort of try out whether guinea pigs, in a sense, is whether we can change people's sexuality and gender expression or gender identity, and it didn't work in any of these cases.
They wanted it to work. And there is a view that it was very helpful to their future careers as well, because they all got on well. Yes.
Well, some got accolades and rewards and for service to the profession and stuff like that. So there was a sense in which this was, until the tide changed.
Well, the gay liberation activism started in the early 70s, didn't they? And I think Feldman went to a conference, didn't he? And he was heckled. And there were protests from gay activists.
Yeah, so in the early 70s it started to be... I mean, I remember when Hans Eysenck described aversion therapy as just a bit like a trip to the dentist.
Yes.
You know, and then...
That was Eysenck, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it was. And Peter Tatchell and the Gay Liberation Front, they made a big deal of this, that it's, how outrageous it was to be comparing it to just a trip to the dentist sort of thing. And that was the way it was seen. It was just like, it's just something that you'd have to, and really minimising the distress involved in it. So I want to fast forward a little bit to kind of, obviously, with the three people we're sort of talking about as well, they, they all came out in some way or other. It wasn't, the treatment didn't work, so to speak. So I just wanted to sort of fast forward in a way to how you then kind of came to terms with your sexuality, really, rather than wanting to.
Well, one thing that I didn't mention was with the electric shocks, and then when I debriefed with them a couple of days later,
that's right,
and said, I really am not attracted to any of those semi-naked women in the photographs. I also said that I was beginning to really dislike that man who was pressing the switch.
Who was giving electric shocks?
Giving me electric shocks. But the other thing they told me was that as part of my daily life, I had to start ignoring women altogether. I didn't have to even look at them. I didn't have to pay any attention to them, and not to make any friends with women. Instead, I had to focus entirely on men and try and think about them in a sexual way. And the irony of that was that I'd already perfected, a heterosexual outward appearance, but getting to feel heterosexual inside was shockingly difficult. I never did that. I never could. But the pretending became even more intense. So I went back to Durham for my last 2 years, and in my final term at the Easter, I felt so worn out and depressed with the effort of trying to be heterosexual and doing what I've been told, that I went back to Crunsell Hospital, and by this time McCulloch and Feldman had moved to Birmingham. So I saw Dr. DeVille Mather, and I must say he was well, I thought he was helpful, but he diagnosed a reactive depression, and it was a reactive depression to the aversion therapy because it was doing me so much harm and damage by that time.
So he must have recognised that.
I think he recognised it wasn't a success as far as I was concerned.
Which suggests that there must have been other people who had also come back in some distress.
Yeah.
Due to the treatment or the intervention that they were.
Well, what he did, he admitted me to the psychiatric ward. I think I was there nearly 3 weeks, and I was, I got some heavy doses of antidepressants and sedatives, and they discharged me and sent me back to Durham, and I was sort of drugged and dulled, and how I graduated, I don't know. So I left, and for the next 3 years I did my teaching experience, which I needed to do to qualify as an educational psychologist. So I did my educational psychology professional training at Manchester University, and it was during that time that I met this woman, Vivian. She'd been at St Mary's College at Durham with me, and she was an out lesbian. She wore this black cloak with a bright red lining, and she went stomping round, and everyone said she's a lesbian. Because people can't say the word lesbian, they find it very difficult. So she was a lesbian. So I met her. I just met her, and we talked, and she said that she was part of a community of lesbians, and invited me for dinner, something like that. So I met these lesbians, and I thought, and it was lovely. It's like taking your corsets off. I felt comfortable. I felt more energised, and I felt at home, and I sort of shed all these instructions. I thought, I'm not taking notice of them anymore. I can't do it anymore. So I started to heal then. I started to accept and feel okay about being a lesbian. And it was during that year that I met my partner, who I lived with for the next 20 years.
So if that community had been available for you, you would never have
wouldn't have gone near Promsall.
No, because you wouldn't have needed to, would you?
No. I mean, it'd be like the end of any relationship. I'd have been very sad and so on and so on, but carried on. But I obviously did carry some of the damage that had done. I think I still felt a bit shameful, and so on. And although my partner and I lived openly, she had 2 children, so I was co-parenting 2 step-sons as well. I still carried some of that shame. But then in the mid-80s, which was at the height of the second wave feminist movement, I did the MA in Women's Studies at Bradford University, and it was superb. It made such a difference to me. I saw everything through quite a different pair of spectacles, and the scales just dropped from my eyes. And I had to do an essay on sexuality, I think it was, and as part of that, I think I've told you before, I read this poem by Judy Grahn. Should I tell you what it? Because this was such a trigger.
Was this the poem that was in your essay?
Yeah.
Because you ended up sending me your essay.
Oh, my essay later as well. Because my article, it's Judy Grahn's, and it's a sort of poem stroke prose, and it's called The Psychoanalysis of Edward the Dyke. And it was in an anthology in 1978 called The Work of the Common Woman. And the bit that was largely responsible for this shift in my truth, really, because the truth had been that that I had this behaviour disorder, that I was sexually perverted, but I was, living a lesbian life at that point. But it said, Edward rolled to the floor. I am vile, I am vile. Dr. Knox flipped a switch at his elbow, and immediately a picture of a beautiful woman appeared on screen over Edward's head. The doctor pressed another switch, and electric shocks jolted through her spine, and Edward screamed. He pressed another switch, stopping the flow of electricity, and then another switch, and a photo of a gigantic, erect male organ flashed into view, coated in powdered sugar. Dr. Knox handed Edward a lollipop. And it was that made me think, that it wasn't these sort of kindly men who'd offered me this treatment, that the electric shocks, it was physical violence, and the fear and anxiety, that was emotional violence. And that's what they'd done to me in those sessions. And at that point, I felt angry. I felt very angry.
So it's a kind of process of politicization in a way.
Yeah.
To kind of consciousness raising, I guess.
It was.
Seeing what happened to you, not just as an individual thing, but something about violence towards gay, lesbian people.
But, yeah. So then I think that's when the true healing started, because my understanding of it and my truth of it changed. And that sort of links in with your theory of truth and reconciliation, doesn't it? Because I think we said earlier, there's rarely such thing as absolute truth. There are just different points of view. And my point of view shifted quite dramatically and very positively. And what I realised at the end of that women's studies course was that the battle wasn't inside me, fighting my shame and humiliation and so on. The battle was outside in a patriarchal and heteronormative society, the homophobia that you don't have to scratch very far to find even now. Where women are beaten up for holding hands on a bus or killed on the beach. But when you get to nearly 80, it mellows.
So tell us about that experience. So going from kind of real anger and rage at what happened to you, quite rightly, kind of in the sense of... I got on with my life. I got on with being an educational psychologist. Right. Yeah. And as I said, I had 2 boys, and my second partner had a young child as well. So I was parenting again. But thinking about how you felt towards the psychologists who were also became a psychologist and worked for many years as a psychologist, as an educational psychologist, but at the same time having this dreadful experience that was inflicted on you by psychologists. So it was not a good position to be in. So there's kind of a sense of real conflict there. How did you kind of manage that? Did you kind of compartmentalize it, or did you kind of try and address it, or did you try not to think about it? How did you sort of... I think I tried to be less sort of in the closet. I mean, I wasn't in the closet because I was living with a female partner. But it's the things that you don't say, like when you go in the office on Monday morning, everyone says, Did you and your husband and the kids go such and such a place? Yeah. I never joined in those conversations because at that time, being a child psychologist, I could have lost my job if it had been in the public arena. It was sort of in the private arena of my colleagues, but not out in Manchester City, sort of. Did you ever come across in your professional life some of the psychologists who'd been involved in this kind of process? Was it something that you'd ever...
I think when I'd finished that women's studies course, I was more aware of women's situation generally, as well as lesbians in the middle of that. And I came up and got all my female colleagues sort of really stirred up, so that was very exciting. And it was at a time when Manchester had just opened its equal ops unit, and we had ethnic minorities, women, the disabled, lesbians and gay men. And I remember a memo had to go round that lesbians and gay men shouldn't be referred to as etceteras, etceteras, because people would say ethnic minorities, women, the disabled, etc., etc. They still couldn't say the word lesbian, so people had to be forced to acknowledge our presence. So there was that. So I think I became more confident, and I suppose if you had to label yourself at the time, I became a radical lesbian feminist. And it wasn't easy having stepsons, because the idea was that women's energy should be withdrawn from the service of men and so on. So that happened. And then I think I became worn out by Manchester because it was a very active, in-your-face authority. So I moved to one of the other Greater Manchester authorities, and it was much more gentle there. And that anger and so on left me, because when I'd finished the women's studies course, and I was very angry, I wanted to sue Crimsall Hospital, I wanted to sue Feldman, I wanted to sue McCulloch, and most of all I wanted Valerie Mellor to get a comeuppance. I didn't know how. So that festered away because there was nothing to do, really, that I had time for, or that I knew.
So just to be clear, so Valerie was the woman that they replaced with. She was in charge of the electric shocks when they took the chap away, because you.
That's right. She appeared a couple of days after I said, "I'm really beginning to dislike that man."
Yeah. So they replaced her. They replaced him with her. So she ended up giving you the electric shocks.
She gave me the electric shocks.
And you felt really angry with her for that.
I don't know whether it was because she was a woman and I felt she should know better.
Well, also there is this. I mean, again, fast forward a few years. So when you ended up publishing your story in the Psychologist magazine a few years ago, quite a few psychologists came to apologise.
Yeah. There was some terrifically supportive letters came after my article, but I didn't do the article and left it until after I'd met you, and we had our conversation, and that terrific moment when we realised that I was one of the women that you found in your research.
I mean, it's really bizarre this happening, because I remember when I started that research, I remember talking with Tommy Dickinson, who wrote the book Curing Queers, which is about nurses and aversion therapy, and it was mostly focused on gay men and transvestites or transgendered people who were subjected to aversion therapy, and I said, I've got this little bit of money to look into what happened to lesbians and bisexual women, whether they got it as well. And he said to me, it'll be like finding a needle in a haystack, because there's so few. They didn't really happen to that many women. And I looked through all the literature, and I found these two women that had been talked about by Feldman and McCulloch. And I thought, my God, what a story. And I was like, I'm never gonna, how am I going to find, and it wasn't really what I was intending to do, because I was doing a bottom-up archive study. But then I happened to be walking with an old friend of mine, walking the dog, and she was saying, "Oh, what are you working on at the moment?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on this project." And she said, "Oh, I've got a friend who had that." I was like, "Oh my God!" So then she put me in touch with you, and you came round for dinner, and then we had this long conversation. And I was like, and as you were telling your story, I thought, I've heard this story before. And I thought, this story it's been written about in this book. So I remember getting to get the article and showing it to you, and you kind of going a bit pale and saying,
Yeah.
"Oh my God, that's me and Suzanne, my friend, and my partner, my girlfriend, whatever it was then." And you had no idea that this had been written up as a success story, which it was.
Yes, yeah.
These were the successful treatment, if you like.
And we lived just a few hundred yards from each other for several years.
Yes.
That's
so
what
just
made
so
it spooky. Yeah. So it was having that conversation. But I think shortly after that we had lockdown, and I think during lockdown it gave me thinking time.
Yes, because it was 2018 that we met, wasn't it? The end of 2018, and of course COVID and everything.
Was,
So there was all that time where, so I was carrying on. I mean, that was towards the end of the archive research I was doing.
Yeah.
But then you decided you wanted to write your own story, because I'd written a little bit about what I'd found out from my research, and you wanted to write more. You wanted to kind of take ownership of your story.
Yeah, I felt it would be helpful to write that. I wanted to write that, and I wrote it. But I think, because I sent you a copy to look at, didn't I? And then you introduced me to Rebecca Winter, who was doing the Birmingham investigation into Feldman and McCulloch's work there.
Because they'd basically taken the work they were doing in Manchester and imported it into Birmingham, so there was quite a few...
And the Birmingham University was implicated in that, because they were their employees and so on.
And someone had complained that they'd been given aversion therapy at the university there,
right.
So they were doing an investigation of that.
Yeah.
And interesting, they're now, as far as we're aware, they're doing some sort of similar investigation about what happened in Manchester now, all these years on, to look at how this came to happen, how this treatment or intervention was seen as acceptable to do to LGBT people at that time, and to try and sort of like come to terms with that history, really.
Yeah. So
one of the things I wanted to ask you is like, have you what you wanted from the psychology profession, if you like, from this experience? What do you want them to do, or how did you want either individual psychologists who might have been involved in this, or the profession as a whole? How did you want them to respond to your story? What kind of response did you want from that?
I had communications with John Sutton, who's the editor of The Psychologist, and he was incredibly supportive and encouraging. So it went in more or less as I'd written it. And I think I said at the end, it was, having spoken to you, having looked at Rebecca's piece of research, at the end of which the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Birmingham did quite a powerful apology. So that gave me confidence. Not last.
I was asking, what kind of response did you want from psychologists, if you like? What kind of reaction, or did you want an apology? Did you want a reconciliation?
I thought by that time
revenge,
it was time that the British Psychological Society had apologised, because it was mainly the application of a psychological theory. The College of Psychiatry had apologised. The president
had Wendy Byrne, I think, had issued an apology. That was, I think, in response to an article about Jeremy's experience, and she kind of apologised.
But I think British Societies for Counselling and so on, a number of them had apologised as well. So I think I thought an apology would be nice. By that time, the desire to sue had mellowed, really, and I thought an apology would suffice. So I think I was hoping for that, and I must say I was very taken aback by the responses I got to my article. There were some very, very supportive comments about it, and said, it needed to be written. It was a powerful piece of writing and so on. And a lot of clinical psychologists responded. So that was very boosting and very helpful.
Can you tell about what the quality of that, when you said like you felt really pleased with the response in a way?
Yeah.
What was it, the quality about that response that was
I think
important to you?
yeah. There was no trolling or anything like that. That what they were saying was that what you said in your article, how you've portrayed it, how you've captured it, shows what an appalling practice it was, what a cruel practice it was, and and one woman said, she couldn't understand why at the time the psychologists administering electric shocks to change your behaviour, why they didn't. Where was their intuition? Where was their compassion? Where was their understanding? Yeah. That enabled them to strap you in a chair and give you electric shocks. So it was that affirmation, I think, as much as anything. And a couple of the officers in the British Psychological Society said similar things, but I have to say, I think it did stop short of an apology. They were outraged, they were shocked, all those things, but there wasn't.
Well, individuals apologised, didn't they? But
individuals,
not the institution as a whole.
Yeah,
I think that's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there was but there was Jim Orford's response was. So he'd been involved in to some extent.
Jim Orford was one of the trainee psychologists at the time, because his name appeared on a couple of the articles that they wrote. Jim was very apologetic, and he said at the time when he was doing it, his critical faculty was nowhere to be seen, and that he was enthralled to the sort of structural imperative of, he was a trainee, this is what psychology was, this is what it did, and therefore this is what you do.
And at that point, though, I think he talked about the sort of the hubris of the profession at that time, thinking it could do all this stuff, and that people wanting to make careers or do research about these things.
Yeah. But he apologised.
Yeah, exactly.
Quite a long response, and that was included next to my article. With his apology, and of course he was at the symposium at Birkbeck. Because there have been, I think from that discussion we had that night, we met and had that moment of realisation. I think there have been a lot of ripples, including our discussion today. I mean, I know there have been others as well in different directions.
So thinking about the because obviously, I think the other thing Jim mentioned in that response was that he wasn't aware of the wider sort of context in a way.
No,
because like we said before, this was before the Gay Liberation Front, the gay movement, if you like, that was growing up to contest these kind of treatments that was sort of slightly predated this. There was the early kind of campaign for homosexual equality and stuff, but it was the bigger sort of the more politically motivated sort of movement was in it, wasn't around at the time. So psychologists weren't aware of that, and so he was sort of saying that it's really important for people to know about these. Kind of
there was one psychology lecturer at Birmingham University, Mike Innes, who became a professor out in Australia, professor of psychology, and he was the one who wrote about cognitive dissonance.
That's right.
From the point of view of the therapists administering electric shocks to people to change their behaviour, because he thought at a human level, they would have been quite repulsed, but at a professional level, they had to do it. And how did you reduce that cognitive dissonance and make it okay with yourself. He also said that some people might have thought it was a jolly good thing and there was no cognitive dissonance to reduce.
Well,
and perhaps with Valerie Miller, you know, she had no qualms about it.
Well,
but he certainly did, and he said there were other colleagues at Birmingham who were uneasy by this time, because this was 1971. That was when he started to express unease about what they were doing.
So would you say it's had a long-term impact on you, having that intervention, if you like? Would you say it's kind of, I mean, it's how many years? 60 years
ago now?
It's
about 60 years.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's still very vivid. It's clearly still vivid. You know, you remember it very vividly.
I think I pushed it further and further back inside. It was still there, sort of hovering. I think it didn't make me into a nice heterosexual woman. So, I mean, in that sense, it failed completely. But I think there are some remnants of what they did, and I think it's in the area of levels of anxiety. I think a lot of things I do now, and I mean, I suppose it's fairly normal and natural to have a level of anxiety about some of the things you do, but I think it's there. I don't think it ever. Well, I don't know whether it stopped me from doing things. I think the harm it did was when I was at Durham, I was so preoccupied with what I was having to do. You know, look at the men, not the women, and electric shocks and so on. How I graduated, I don't know. And it was only when I retired, about 16 years ago now, that I joined the Open University and did a first degree in English literature and got a first. And I did my MA and did a distinction, and I concentrated on lesbian literature, and I found that very rewarding, because I was looking not only at lesbian past, but my past as part of that, and that has been incredibly helpful to me. But I think, as I said, being a psychologist, it put me on the outside of a lot of things, including friendships, because I still make friends, and I don't tell them, I don't say, you know, well, I'm a lesbian, you know, it might be there and understood, but and I think one of the saddest things is that I never discussed it with my mother.
Yeah.
After that time, when she found Suzanne's letter and said, you want to see someone, we didn't discuss it again, ever, after that. And yet she knew. I mean, she was part of my relationships. She was part of my stepson's lives. But we never said the L word. The only time she referred to it, I think I was in my 40s, and I'd just got home from work, and she came on the phone and she said, I've just been listening to a programme on the radio, she said, and I think that homosexuals are a gift from God. And I mean, I was tired, it was at the end of work, and I just didn't know what to say. I was speechless. So, and that was the only opportunity to I mean, I could have talked to her about it any time, but we didn't do that in our family. We just went quiet.
I mean, I guess when you think about, like, obviously aversion therapy doesn't work, but like what it does do is there is that sense of putting together a kind of, you know, there is a punishment. You know,
yeah.
Shocking people is a kind of punishment, and that sort of sense of reinforcing that inner sense of shame that you had.
Yeah.
And it kind of reinforces that, which was kind of what it was intended to do, in the sense that they thought it might end up and bizarrely that increasing shame and punishment would kind of make you straight or something, which is a really odd.
I mean, it was so primitive.
Yeah, it's just
yeah.
But that it has that lasting. I know other people have spoken about it that we've met.
Yeah.
Like Caroline and Jeremy, kind of talking, about the trauma of that experience and of having your sexuality or gender identity kind of punished in that way. Whether it's and with Jeremy particularly kind of...
Jeremy was very damaged by the whole thing, incredibly damaged. And he wouldn't mind me saying that because he records it in his book.
Yeah. I think it's fantastic that these stories and accounts are coming out finally, and I feel really, heartened that you're able to tell this story now, and that others are too, and that more and more people. It's a bit like a Me Too kind of thing, isn't it? That people are starting to talk about this experience more openly, and that sort of stops or hopefully kind of prevents more the shame kind of cycle kind of continuing. And I guess it's also a warning really to psychology as a discipline, because partly it's over enthusiasm of this, having this new model of treatment that be able to, and the damage that it inflicted on many LGBT people, and that maybe psychologists need to think about some of the things that it might be doing now. I don't know much about applied behavioural therapy, but I know that's still something that is practiced, not aversion therapy isn't practiced anymore, but there are some things that maybe psychologists are doing now that in the future we might start to question. And I guess I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or what you'd want to say to current psychologists really that are working to what they need to be thinking about or be aware of when they're enthusiastic about a new intervention.
I think the first thing that came to mind was what Carolyn says to me every time I have a conversation with her, because my habit is to refer to it as aversion therapy. Yeah. And she always corrects me. She said, I cannot call it aversion therapy. She said, I've got to call it aversion practice, she said, because there was nothing therapeutic whatsoever in what they did to me. Yeah. And I think there are all sorts of therapies now, aren't there? Yeah. And I think it's that awareness that what is being done now in the name of therapy might not stand the test of time. Yeah. And so you don't have to wait another 60 years to say that was so damaging, that was harmful.
Yes. And that's a really good point, isn't it? It's like just calling something therapy doesn't make it...
It doesn't make
therapeutic.
It helpful. No, doesn't make it therapeutic.
Yeah, and that we maybe need to question some of the things the practices that we might be inflicting on people. I guess the other thing for me is about the importance of attending to bigger sort of social movements that are happening, and the support available to people. And those next movements, whether it's the lesbian and gay movement, the trans movement, the neurodiversity movement, whether it's new identities or new kind of experiences that are pathologized by psychologists, that are then and thinking about, well, how do we understand this, and look to those movements that are trying to do back when the Gay Liberation Front were contesting aversion therapy, that we need to sort of be aware of where these kind of movements are today, and taking those movements quite seriously, rather than because they're easy to pathologize as well. As the Gay Liberation Front, now people like Peter Tatchell, quite rightly, is seen as a national treasure in most contexts. But at the time, he wasn't. Oh, he was vilified.
He was a bad boy.
Really bad. And I think the same might be said in the future of people now that are, he was really badly kind of treated by mainstream society. And he was, people like him were the people that were standing up against aversion therapy at the time. and going against the grain, you
Yeah.
know, and that how important that is to look to people that are doing that now and not seeing them as troublemakers, but maybe that they have something important to say.
I must say, I don't want sort of to appear to be just rubbishing psychology generally, because when I think about my career as an educational psychologist, I mean, for the first 17 years I worked in an inner city area, and I worked with children and young people with special educational needs and their families. And I was then drawn towards working jointly with social services departments, and I became the education representative on the multi-agency child protection training team. So I was involved in devising and delivering child protection training. I know it's called safeguarding now, and safeguarding is quite a woolly term. I mean, what does that mean? Who are you safeguarding? But child protection, you knew what you were doing. And it was a multi-agency training. It was the police, it was health visitors, it was nurseries, it was schools. And it was like the city trying to build a wall of protection around its children. So that was incredibly, you know, rewarding. We didn't always succeed in protecting children, as you know, but you know, that was I was there as an educational psychologist doing that. And then after that, I left the local authority and started doing psychological assessments of children who were involved in care proceedings in the family law courts. And that was fascinating, because when you're being cross-examined in court, you need to have been very careful about what you're presenting as evidence and so on. So that was quite challenging. And then in the last few years, and I mean, I worked for over 40 years as an educational psychologist, I chaired 2 adoption panels, one a voluntary adoption agency and the other one a local authority, one of the Greater Manchester adoption panels. And I was vice chair of another voluntary adoption panel. And I was their education advisor as well, because quite a lot of the children who came to be matched with the prospective adopters had educational problems. So I was able, hopefully, to add value, you know, because of my profession. And I have absolutely no regrets whatsoever about being an educational psychologist. It had its challenges, it had its frustrations, but at the end of the day, I met some terrific people, some teachers, parents, colleagues, children. Absolutely no regrets whatsoever. So I don't, you know, that was just a part of psychology. For me, my experience as a practicing educational psychologist was I've absolutely no regrets.
I guess there's something coming full circle with this now, because retiring several years ago and now coming out with your experience, your story before you trained to be an educational psychologist. There's something about coming back to that and being maybe, I don't know, being a bit freer to be able to talk about that a little bit more openly.
Yeah,
now
absolutely.
Now you've left, now you've retired, if you like. Yeah. So there's a sort of a nice kind of.
It's and you know, since we met and what's happened have been very affirming and given permission for me to do a lot of the things that I've done. Well,
I'm really glad that we've met, and I'm really glad to have, you know, this conversation now, revisiting this conversation after all these years, and hopefully this will continue, and more, you know, it might be that more people will come forward to talk about their experiences in similar ways, and I think that'd be a great thing if that could happen, and maybe as a society we can start to come to terms with this, both as the psychological society and society as a whole can come to terms with the lasting legacy of what we did to LGBT people in the past and continuing to today. So thank you so much for talking.
Thank you
today.
And to you, Hel. Thanks.